G'day everyone, my name is Hoi, and in this video I'll show you how to make this cool line art with both portraits and text. Okay, so let's open the photo that we'll be using. Now I've linked the photo in the description if you want to follow along. Let's go to File, Open. Let's navigate to the folder where you've got your image saved, click on the file and press Open. Now the first thing that we'll do is unlock this background layer and rename it. So let's double click on the word background and then rename this to model and press return on our keyboard. I'm going to make a smart object out of this, and the reason for that will become clearer, but for the time being let's right click on that and press convert to smart object. Now the next thing that I want to do is make the horizontal lines across that you saw on the intro. Now because I want the lines to be evenly spaced throughout top and bottom, and I don't want to do it manually, what I'm going to do is add some grid lines. So I'm just going to turn off this model layer here so it doesn't distract us, and because I want to see what I'm doing instead of this transparent layer here, I'm going to add a solid color by going up here, go up to solid color. I'm going to pick white as my background, press OK, and then just click and drag it to the bottom. Now let's create the grid lines that I just spoke about. So we can go to View and go to Guides and then New Guide Layout. Now you can see that I've already made my settings from my practice earlier. You can copy my settings here. The critical ones are columns and rows. Don't check columns, check rows, and the number of rows that we want is 50, and then you can leave all these blank. Now I've got clear existing guides here just in case that you've got existing guides that you want to remove, otherwise it will create these rows on top of it. So just to be sure, just make sure that you click on clear existing guides and then press OK. Now to make our lines go across from here to here, I'm going to use the line tool. Now I've already got it selected here, but by default it's actually set on rectangle tool like this. So if that's your setting, just click and hold until these options fly out and just go down and select line tool. I'm going to click and drag across here, but to make my job easier, I want the cursor to be snapping to my grid lines. If you don't have it snapping to your grid lines, let's click on View and make sure that you've got Snap on. Scroll down to Snap to and just make sure that Guides is also selected. I'm going to click out of that. Make sure that your fill is 0, well, empty. And if it's not empty, just click on this bit here and then your stroke is black. So to change the color of that, just click on that. And if you don't already have it as a recently used color, you can click on this color palette here and just select black and press OK. Now the pixels that we want is 10 pixels, and now we're ready to make our line. So let's click here and then hold down Shift, so then you can get a perfectly horizontal line here. Now just to make sure that I've got this line smack bang on the center of the grid lines, I'm going to zoom in and just see where the line is resting on. So to pan across, I've just held down spacebar and then clicking and dragging across with my mouse. So I'm going to select my move tool V on the keyboard and then activate my transform control tools by pressing Command or Control T, and these transform handles will come out. Now what I'm looking for is this middle box here, and just making sure that the grid lines is going across the middle of that center box there. So that's close enough. So I'm happy with that. So I'm going to click on this check mark, zoom back out by pressing Command or Control 0. And what we need to do is replicate that through all the canvas all the way down here. Now I don't want to do it manually. You can see how long that will take. So what I'm going to do is do a semi-automated way. To do that, just make sure that our line 1 layer is selected, and then duplicate that by pressing Command or Control J, and then press Command or Control T to bring out our transform control handles. And let's just zoom in. And what I'm going to do is move my cursor until I have this triangular cursor here, and then with shift held on my keyboard, I'm going to click and drag until it snaps onto the next grid line. Again, I'm going to pan across, spacebar on my keyboard, and then click and drag. And just to make sure that the middle transform handles here is cutting across this guideline here. Now this is too zoomed out, so I'm going to press Option on the keyboard and then scroll wheel mouse up, and then just to check that it is smack bang in the middle, and this is in the middle, so I'm good with that. I'm going to accept that by pressing this check mark here, or you can press return on your keyboard. Let's zoom back out again, Command or Control 0, and with that second line created, now we can automate it, or at least semi-automate it, by pressing Command Option Shift T. If you're on a PC, that's Control Alt Shift T. That will create another line with the same amount of spacing. Now what we need to do is repeat that until we have the black bars running down the page. Now you can stop at the second last grid line here. You don't need to go all the way down to the last grid line. And once you've got that, you can see the layers panel has got a lot of layers here. So what we want to do is tidy that up. So click on the top line here and then scroll down all the way to the last one, which is the line 1. Press shift on your keyboard and then click on this layer, so all these layers are selected, and then we're going to merge them together. Let's press Command or Control E, and then that has merged all the lines onto one layer. What we're going to do now is convert this to a smart object. Right click on the empty area here and then select Convert to Smart Object. Now just to make sure that our layers are tidy, let's rename that by double clicking on it and typing in horizontal lines and press return on our keyboard. What we need here is that this should be above the model layer. So what you can do is click and drag it above the model layer here. So what I want to do now is hide these grid lines because it is a bit distracting. I don't want to get rid of it. I don't want to clear it. I just want to hide it. Let's press Command or Control semicolon. So I'm going to turn on the visibility of the model layer just to see what we've got so far. Now, as you can see here, the lines doesn't really interact with the model. And for the horizontal lines to interact with the model, we need to do two things. One is to create a curves adjustment layer, and then the other is to create a threshold layer. You'll see why that is the case later, but for the time being, let's create the curves adjustment layer. Let's click on the model layer, and that's because I want the curves above the model layer here. So let's go to our adjustment layer icon, go up to curves, and for the time being, I'm not going to change any of the settings. What I am going to do is create a threshold layer. So because I want it on top of the horizontal lines, I'm going to click on this layer here and then go to my adjustment layer icon and go down to threshold. Now my menu is off my screen recording, but I have just pressed on threshold and you can see that this is the threshold graph here. Now before we go on, I just want to explain what threshold is doing. You can see that it has a harsh effect on our image. So what is it doing? You see that there's a tab here, and that tab is at the position 128. Now most of you would know in an RGB 8-bit image, the luminance range goes from 0 to 255, 0 being black and 255 being white, and then the layers of gray in the middle. So with this tab in the middle, what it's saying is that anything above 128 all the way to 255 would change the luminance of that pixel to white. And anything from 0, which is black, all the way up to 128, which is midtone or 50% gray, would turn that to black. And that is exactly what's happening here. Now you can see that the lines are still lines and it's still not interacting with the image. What we need to do is add some blur both to the horizontal lines and the model layer here. So I'm just going to make a little bit more room for my layers here. Click on my horizontal line layer, go up to filter, go to blur and select Gaussian blur. The Gaussian blur depends on your image. I've been playing around with this image and it seems like a value of somewhere like 8-ish, 8.2 looks okay, and then I'm going to press OK. I need to have the same blur. Well, I don't need to have, but I prefer to have some blur on the model image as well. So instead of going up to filter, blur, etc., what I can do is just replicate this Gaussian blur here by pressing Option or Alt on my keyboard and then click on the word Gaussian blur and then just drag that property down to my model layer, and then that will replicate that blur there. Now you don't see it because it's not expanded. I'm going to expand it by pressing this chevron here, and then because the blur is too much, I can double click on this and then just adjust it maybe halfway to say 4.2. This is still too extreme, so there are a few more settings that we need to adjust, one of which is the threshold itself, and then the other one is the curves. So let's adjust the threshold curves first and just bring this down a little bit again. And instead of 128, what I'm going to do is just minimize the harshness by going to around about 84. And you can see that if I go even more to the left, you can see that it's becoming less black. So I want a balance of maybe 80 something. Maybe 81 will do. So as you can see, threshold impacts the whole image as one layer. You don't have much control over it. Now to give a little bit more control, what we can do is use the curves layer here. Again, I'm just going to make myself some room here, and the point here controls the dark points, and then the point here controls the light point. So if I click and drag this to another point, what it's saying is that I'm controlling the dark areas. So in the dark areas, I'm just making it a little bit lighter. So something like this, and then the white point or the bright points, I'm just going to adjust it until I like what I see. So it will take some trial and error. So that looks good to me, and as I said, the threshold layer applies the effect uniformly across the image, whereas the curves adjustment layer gives us a little bit more control where we want the brights and darks to show up. But what if, for example, I don't want these lines here? I can always play around with this, but it kind of adjusts the whole image as well, which is what I don't want. I just, for instance, want to get rid of this or accentuate that. The good news is that we can. We have to create a new layer between the curves layer and the model layer. So I can click on the model layer here and then create a new layer here. Let's rename that so we can keep track of our layers. So manual adjustment, return on our keyboard, and then I'm going to press B for my brush tool, and with black as my foreground color, I'm just going to reduce the flow so the effect is not that much. So maybe a flow of 9%. I'm just going to soften the edge of my brush. So on a Mac, I'm pressing Control Option left click on the mouse and then just move my mouse up. If you're on a PC, it's Alt right click on your mouse and then push your mouse up. So now that I've got my right brush setting, I can just paint in the areas where I want more black to show. If I don't want that to show, I'm just going to undo that. Just say I don't want this to show and I want it to disappear. Instead of black, I'm going to use white as my foreground color. I can click on this toggle switch or press X on my keyboard and then do the same thing here. So you can see that by using the brush tool and using white or black as your foreground color, you can add or subtract the lines away in certain areas and not affect the whole image. Now I'm going to turn off this manual adjustment layer because I'm okay with the effect that it had. And what I want to show you now is the different types of variations you can create by just using different patterns. Now for this design, we've just used simple horizontal patterns here, but you can always create wavy patterns, for example. So let's just demonstrate that. I'm going to turn off the visibility of the horizontal layer here. I'm going to add another layer. I'm going to bring back my grid lines. I can do that by pressing Command or Control semicolon, and I'm just going to use my line tool again and make sure that all my settings are the same as before. No fill, black as my stroke, and 10 pixels for my stroke. And then I'm just going to do a line here. Now I'm going to click and then press Shift and then drag my mouse across so I can get a perfectly horizontal line here. And then I'm just going to zoom in just to check out whether I've got the line smack bang on the grid line. So I'm going to press V on the keyboard and then press Command or Control T to bring out my transform control handles. And what I'm checking for again is just to see whether this grid line is cutting across this middle box here, which it is. So I'm going to press this check mark just to accept that, and then I'm going to zoom out by pressing Command or Control 0. Now the next step is to make a wave. So let's go to Filter, Distort, and select Wave. Now it's going to ask us whether we want to convert this layer to a smart object or rasterize. You can do either. For the time being, I'm just going to rasterize it. And I've already played around with this, so the wave that I want is something like this. And to generate that, you can copy my settings here. Number of generators 20, wavelength is here, amplitude is here, and scale is here. Don't forget to make sure that your type is sine and your undefined edges are repeat edge pixels. I'm going to press OK, and that has transformed my straight line into a wave. Now what I want to do is replicate this across the page like before. So the first step is to duplicate this by pressing Command or Control J, and then let's bring out our transform control handles, Command or Control T. Let's press Shift and click to move this down to the next row. What I'm looking for, as always, if I zoom in here, is that the middle box here is running across this grid line here, which looks like it is. I'm going to accept that and then zoom out again. And remember, to replicate the wavy lines down the page, we can press Command Option Shift T, or if you're on a PC, that's Control Alt Shift T. Now for this, we're going to go past the second last grid line here, so we don't have this blank space here. So I'm going to press that option again. That's Command Option Shift T, and just make sure that we've got one more to fill in the space. Now I'm going to pan up the document, and you can see that there are blank spaces here. So I'm going to press Command or Control and then click on the first line, and what that does is select the layer on the layers panel here, and I'm going to replicate that by pressing Option or Alt on my keyboard and then press Shift to constrain it vertically, and then just push one up here. The reason why I didn't do that in the first place is that you see these peaks here is being cut off. If I've replicated this one here, all the peaks that I replicate subsequently will be cut off as well. That's why I started off with this second one here. I'm going to replicate this again, so just to catch this empty space here, and then you can just see the tiny edges here. I'm going to fit it to screen, and then I'm going to hide the grid line. So Command or Control semicolon, and then let's deal with all these layers here. So we're going to merge them like we did for the horizontal line. So let's click on the top one, scroll all the way down to the first one, press Shift and then press Command E on the keyboard. Let's scroll back up. Let's make a smart object out of this. Right click on the empty area. Let's select Convert to Smart Object. And you know me by now, let's make sure that we name our layers. So wavy lines. The next thing that we need to do, if you remember, is apply a Gaussian blur on this wavy line. So instead of recreating it from scratch, what I can do is just copy it from our horizontal lines here. So let's press Option or Alt on our keyboard, click on the word Gaussian blur, and then just move that effect on the wavy lines layer here. And you can see that it's already had an effect here, and you can see if I just click on this chevron here that the effect is contained here as well. This looks pretty good to me, but again, if you want to adjust it, you can always adjust the blur by double click on the Gaussian blur word and then just change the radius to however you like. So something like 7.4 looks good to me. And remember, there is the curve settings that you can also change. Now the next effect I'm going to do is not a necessity, but it might just spruce up your design a little bit. So I just want to cut out this design a little bit by putting some sort of a vignette. I'm going to go up to my wavy lines here, go up to my elliptical marquee tool here. Now by default it shows the rectangular marquee tool, so if you don't have that showing, you can access it by clicking and holding until these menu options fly out and just select elliptical marquee tool. Now I've got feather at 0. I'm pointing that out because I want to show you something later, and I'm just going to draw out a marquee so it covers her face and the majority of her arms and hands. Now I want to tilt it. I can do that by pressing on this button here. If you don't see this contextual taskbar here, it does come out with the latest version of Photoshop, which at the time of recording it is 24.5. If you have the latest version but don't see the contextual taskbar, go up to Window and then just make sure that the contextual taskbar is selected. If you don't have or don't want to have the latest version of Photoshop, you can still follow along by going up to Select and then just select Transform Selection, which I'm going to do now since I'm here anyway. And it's going to tell me that while you're transforming your selection, all the smart filters will be turned off, which I'm okay with. So I'm going to press OK. And what I'm going to do here is just click and drag until I got this marquee selection on an angle that I want. And I just want to make sure that the marquee selection is encapsulating the main part of her face and hands. I'm okay with that, so I'm going to press this check mark here. And the next step I'm going to do is let's make a mask out of this by pressing on this icon here. And you can see because my feather is at 0 pixels, the edges are very harsh. What I want to do is actually feather those edges. But the problem with selecting the feather here while I'm making a selection is that I've got 3.3 selected here, but I have no idea what that actually means or actually translate to the actual image. I'm going to deselect that and just show you how I handle that. So with my mask already created, I'm going to make sure that my mask is also selected. Go up to my properties panel and click on select and mask. And from here, all I want to do is use one feature, which is the feather feature here. I'm going to crank that up all the way until I get the effect that I want. And something like this looks great to me. I can push it out further just to see what it does. So maybe even something like 59.5. To me, that looks okay. So I'm going to press OK here. And that's the effect that I have. Now you can imagine that the shapes that you can create is endless. You don't have to be constrained by just the elliptical marquee tool. You can use the lasso tool or the polygonal lasso tool just to make custom shapes and then mask it out as I've done just a few steps before. Now the last thing that I want to do with this portrait is show you that you can actually put some color into this. Now we deliberately used the threshold adjustment to make it black and white, but if you feel like, well, I want to inject some color, we can. I'm going to go up to my threshold layer, which is my top layer here. That's because I'm not actually going to do anything with the threshold layer, but I want the next effect to be on top of this layer. The effect that I want is actually the gradient map. Now, again, the menu options is off my screen. What I'm selecting is the gradient map. After I've clicked on gradient map, this layer shows, and then in my properties panel, I have the gradient map options. I'm going to click on this bar and I can choose any color that I want. I'm probably going to go for this color, but the only problem is that I want the dark areas here, so the blue here, and then the pink all the way to the white area. So just a quick explanation of what the gradient editor does is that whatever's on this side represents the dark areas. So in the dark areas, this peachish pink color will be applied. and then whatever's on the right side represents the highlights or the white side. So whatever's white, this color or the blue color will show. So I actually want it the other way around. Now these color stops don't really do anything, because with threshold you're either white or black. It doesn't really matter what the interim stops are. I can include as many as I like and it won't have any difference. So I'm just going to click and drag these out, and you can see that it's disappeared. I can accept that and then just press reverse, and then you have the effect that I'm going for. Now the next thing that I want to show you is how to apply this to text instead of portraits. I'm just going to turn off this oval effect off by turning off this mask here. I'm going to press shift and then click on this mask just to disable that mask here. And then what I'm going to do is also disable this model layer here. I'm going to click on this model layer because I want a layer on top of that. Just click on this and I'm going to type in text so we can keep track of our layers, and then press T on the keyboard and then just type in something like hello. And you don't see that because it's all in white. I'm going to select all of it by pressing Command or Control A to select everything that I've just typed in. Click on this and then just put it to black and press OK. Now the reason why it's not black is because we have that color gradient there. I'm going to use my move tool V on the keyboard and then just move it a little bit onto the canvas here. It's still a little bit too big, so let's transform that. Command or Control T, and then I'm just going to press Shift and Option, that's Shift and Alt if you're on a PC, to resize that proportionally and from the center here. I'm going to press Return to accept that. What I need to do is also apply the blur, so it gives it that interaction with the layer on top of it. So I've got this Gaussian blur here, but before I can apply it, I'm going to right click and then transform this as a smart object, and then pressing Option or Alt on the keyboard, click and drag this Gaussian blur to the text layer here, and then expand this option here and then just play with the Gaussian blur. This Gaussian blur is having minimal effect because the layer behind it is almost disappearing. We can't see a lot of the wavy lines. So let's just press OK for the time being, and let's go back up to the wavy lines layer, and then let's control that, see what we've get there. So you can see by reducing the blur, the words are interacting a little bit more. Now what we can do is also see what the curves does. So I should have clicked on OK before I clicked on the curves bit. So let's click on curves. Let's play around with this. So as you can see, you can experiment by adjusting the threshold, the Gaussian blur on the wavy lines, and then the Gaussian blur on the text itself. Now the cool thing about the text bit is that if I click on the text layer and use my move tool, I can have different effects as I move the text layer here, which is kind of cool, right? Let's fit it to screen, Command or Control 0. So as you can see, you can use any types of patterns or shapes as the background. The limit is just your imagination. So this is the text layer and this is the portrait. Now you can also double up, and this is with the horizontal layer, and you can reduce the amount of blur to minimize the effect. So you can see that you can create all kind of funky patterns depending on how you combine your lines and your patterns. It's just unlimited. I'm just showing you 2 use cases. And that's how you can create this cool looking line art with both portraits and text. If you like this video or learned something new, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you can see when the next video is out. Until next time everyone, take care.